Let's speak further about Israel's new leadership now. And joining me from West Jerusalem is Mitchell Barak, political analyst and former aide to Benjamin Netanyahu. He was also a speechwriter for Ariel Sharon and a spokesperson for former President Shimon Peres. From The Hague is Mouin Rabbani, co-editor of Jadaliyah, an online magazine produced by the Arab Studies Institute. And from London is journalist and Middle East analyst Tom Gross. Thanks, all three of you, so much for being with me. Mitchell, I'm going to start with you because you are actually on this panel more of the glasses half full panelist. And I say that because you believe the government actually has a collective vested interest in succeeding that goes beyond just ousting Benjamin Netanyahu. So what vested interests do all their opposing interests have in common?
First of all, they have developed a coalition government where everyone is kind of stuck in there. It's in nobody's best interest to break it off and leave, because probably all of those people will be punished by the electorate if we go to another election. So the interest is really to be in there and work. And also, there are so many small components, meaning most of the parties except Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party, most of them have about the same number of mandates. So, they're all kind of sharing the burden equally. It's not even, you can say it's Prime Minister Bennett, but it's really two prime ministers that were elected. It's Prime Minister Bennett and alternate prime minister, soon to be prime minister in 2 years, Yair Lapid. So really, the leadership of the country and the decision making is happening in a group environment and with two people at its head. So at this point, there's a high level of cooperation. They've said from the beginning, it's more than just ousting Netanyahu. That's the first main goal. He's now gone. The country has not had a budget in 3 years, okay? Because we've been in 4 election cycles. There are offices that are not working. There are programs that can't be funded. There are people that don't have money. There's still bailouts from the COVID-19. There's a lot of work to be done. And there's even 2 or 3 parties in there that haven't been in the government.
Okay,
And so they are anxious to really get to work.
maybe saying glasses half full is an understatement. You actually sound pretty confident if you really think Yair Lapid will be prime minister in 2 years' time and won't end up like Benny Gantz.
Well, the first thing is that there's trust between Bennett and between Lapid and Lieberman and Saar and even Mansour Abbas and Nitzan Horowitz from the Meretz Party and Merav Michaeli from the Labor Party. There is a high level of trust that these people are sharing the burden. And Israel is a country. It's not a presidential system. This is a first among equals, and this is actually a first among equals, meaning Naftali Bennett is just a little bit higher than the others, and he doesn't even have more mandates than some of the parties in the coalition. So he's really leading from almost an electoral deficit compared to others. And that's what gives him the mandate to do it, and that it's in no one's best interest to go to elections again.
Mouin Rabbani, do you share Mitchell's optimism there?
I see no reason for optimism about anything that this incoming government will do, particularly with respect to the Palestine question, where this government will at best pursue a policy of more of the same. But with respect to your specific question, I think that even under the best of circumstances, an 8-party coalition is by definition highly unstable. And what we already saw yesterday was that the new government wasn't even able to obtain a parliamentary majority, an absolute majority in its initial vote of confidence, because one of its members decided to abstain. So it's entirely likely that there will be all kinds of issues, expected and unexpected, that will arise in the coming weeks and months that will cut the lifespan of this government short. And of course, the main issue is what will happen to Netanyahu. Will he remain the head of the Likud and succeed in removing, in ensuring the defection of even one member of any of the coalition parties of the government, or will he be removed from the leadership of the Likud, in which case the path is wide open for a more right-wing government, including the Likud and some of the current governing factions, which they will be able to achieve without going to new elections.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about Benjamin Netanyahu in just a second, but Tom Gross first. I mean, a lot of the equation for the success of this government does rely on Naftali Bennett. He is very ambitious. He's an extreme nationalist. And to make this work, he will have to compromise. I mean, how much is a man like that really willing to give?
Well, he has no choice. I think he will shift sharply to the center. Even among his 8-party coalition, his Yamina party, which already lost one of its members, has only six members of the 120-seat Knesset, i.e. 5%. So he has absolutely no choice but to compromise. And also there's a kind of legal agreement with Yair Lapid, who's the alternate prime minister, who's a centrist. And Lapid's Yesh Atid center party has 3 times as many Knesset members as Bennett. So yes, Bennett outflanked Netanyahu from the right, but he's essentially lost his own right-wing electoral base and will, I think, have to govern from the center. He has no choice. I mean, from the Israeli center.
And you don't think at all that Bennett's supporters could be sympathetic to his limits under this coalition?
Well, some might be. It depends what he does. If he actually does go ahead and increase settlement building and take a very hardline position, they'll be happy. But I don't think he can. It's not just that there are 8 parties in the coalition, and I've never heard anywhere in the world in a democratic country or any country of 8 parties governing successfully together, and especially with huge ideological differences. As Mitchell said, they may trust each other, the leaders, but that's relative to the fact they all came together because they don't trust Benjamin Netanyahu. They've only been in office a few hours. I can't see really how there won't be disagreements between them, ideological as well as maybe personal. So I think with Bennett, he's sort of decided to ditch his base, at least for the time being, and I think he'll try and govern in a kind of consensus way, taking on board as much of Israeli society as possible.
Mitchell, while Mouin was speaking, I mean, for as much as he was disagreeing with you, I saw you actually kind of nodding in agreement with him. Why was that?
Well, he does make a point in that it is going to be difficult for all of these parties to govern together. But I do think that they will find common ground and that they will be able to put their differences beside, even as Tom says, that this is it's the largest government that he knows of that's ever governed, 8 parties. We are in the land of miracles. So I'll be a little bit optimistic and cynical, but the point is the Israeli electorate is really beaten down because we've been for 2 years in a government paralysis, more than 2 years. Even when Netanyahu started, when he called for elections. So I think it's very refreshing for people that we're actually going to, first of all, get rid of the divisiveness, some of the hatred, some of the really negative rhetoric, which has come from the prime minister and some of his parties. Some of it, we saw that on display yesterday during the speech of the prime minister-elect Naftali Bennett. So once people calm down and we lower the tones, I think they will be able to govern together. And it is true, again, like Mouin said, that he had extreme difficulty getting to 61 seats. He only got 60 versus 59. But I will mention that the other Arab party, the Joint Arab List, is kind of serving as a safety net. And they kind of hid in the back and didn't vote with everyone else to make sure that the Bennett government would get in. And some of those members actually voted for the new Speaker of the Knesset, Miki Levy. Okay. So they do have a cushion here of a few more mandates from the Joint Arab List, which is historic and significant in and of itself. Not only is Mansour Abbas's party in the government for the first time, an Israeli Arab party is in the government, but they also kind of have a safety net from the other Joint Arab List for certain things that are important, because they also don't want Netanyahu, and their population, from all the polling that I've done, does want to be in the government. Okay. So, and also keep in mind that Bennett is now the winner. Netanyahu is the loser. So people don't usually defect to the loser. They defect and they join the winner.
Mitchell, I like your optimistic cynicism, if I can call it that. But let's look at something arguably less positive. Mouin, I'll come back to you. Benjamin Netanyahu, going forward. It's kind of personal now between Bibi and Naftali Bennett. Some say there's actually going to be a clear element of revenge at play between the two now. So how can Netanyahu actually maneuver to bring this government down the way he wants to? And can you think he can actually return then, should this coalition fall apart?
Well, for Netanyahu to return, there would need to be new elections, and that, I think, will be his biggest obstacle. But, Netanyahu is a past master at incitement, and he showed that again yesterday. And he and his allies will now be ceaselessly inciting against this new government, very much along the lines of his good friend Trump in the United States, that, this is a radical leftist government. It's beholden to the Arabs, which in Israeli politics is the largest sin one can be guilty of. And all he has to do is effectively shame one radical right-wing member of parliament of any of the parties of the current coalition into leaving the coalition, and it's game over. And Netanyahu will then be able to successfully issue a vote of no confidence and go to new elections, which he may well win, because, as was said earlier, many people who voted for Yamina and Avigdor Lieberman and so on will feel betrayed, that they voted for a radical right-wing coalition, and instead they got a very broad one from the radical right to the center left. But having said that, I do think the more likely scenario is Netanyahu being eventually deposed from the leadership of the Likud, and then a new coalition government of right-wing parties being installed without taking Israel to new elections.
Okay. I mean, you describe a pretty easy formula for derailment there. Tom Gross, let me ask you, I mean, is there life left in Likud without Benjamin Netanyahu at its helm?
There's certainly life left in the Likud. In fact, it's the only real substantive major party left in Israel. In the past, there was the center-left Labour Party, which has steadily eroded support, or rather half collapsed over the last 20 or 30 years. And the Likud, by Israeli standards, it has 30 seats, which is 25% of the Knesset. But by Israeli standards, that's huge. No other party has more than about 17 or 18, and most of the parties have, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 30 seats, Likud is easily the largest. To Netanyahu's credit, he has built that party up. And in fact, I would say that ideologically as well, a lot of people are tired of Netanyahu. He's been in power too long. He's an abrasive character that has made a lot of enemies and so on. But ideologically, he's been quite successful, as we see by the fact that 3 or 4 of these other parties in the coalition are kind of spin-offs on the Likud. So there's certainly life left in the Likud. Paradoxically, if Netanyahu stays as the leader of the Likud, because there's antipathy against him, that may be the only reason that the coalition stays together, doesn't go to new elections and keeps the Likud out. But if somebody else manages to come to the fore and lead the Likud, as was just pointed out, there could be a realignment without new elections, and the Likud could enter a coalition with some of the existing more right-wing parties.
Okay. Mitchell, I mean, aside from the political maneuvering for power that might be at play moving forward, let's talk about Naftali Bennett being in charge and what he can actually do for Israel. You mentioned a number of issues that this government will have to tackle, not least the budget. There's also the very serious issue of social division in Israeli society that really has raised its very ugly head, particularly over the last year, I'll say. There is obviously an issue in divisions between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, but there's also a lot of division between Jewish Israelis themselves, the Mizrahi Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic as well. Is it in Naftali Bennett's political interest to actually try to bring more social cohesion among Israeli Jews, or will he try to capitalize on that division the way we've seen done?
No, actually, if you looked at his speech yesterday, he looked very prime ministerial, meaning he looked like he's matured, he looks like he's ready to lead, and he's ready to leave everyone. Mouin had mentioned President Trump. Netanyahu gave a speech in Knesset that President Trump would have dreamed of giving at Biden's inauguration, but had the decency not to show up and not to give.
Mm.
Netanyahu got up there and trashed Naftali Bennett and trashed his government and trashed him personally and was just mean and not nice and wasn't wishing the government well in any way, calling it not legitimate, calling him not a leader, and so forth. Bennett got up there and he was being screamed at by Likud lawmakers, by the ultra-Orthodox, as you mentioned, the friction between the religious Jews because they see him as selling out. They've said, take off your kippah. You don't represent Judaism. You're not a good Jew. Horrible things they said. And as they're screaming at him and he's trying to give his first speech as a prime minister-elect, he says, even though your people didn't vote for me, I represent everyone. I will represent the interests of your people. I appreciate and respect the ultra-Orthodox way of life, and we will protect it. So he's coming out with a message of reconciliation, a message of unity, and he's being met by people that are just being belligerent and mean and not nice.
Okay.
So I think he is going to try and heal Israeli society because that's what they need now. And the advantage is he has a very wide-ranging government and a wide-ranging opinions of people to do that. And that is, I think, going to be his greatest challenge because once he does that, or once he lowers the tone, as I said earlier, there will be a kind of new reckoning and a new looking at government. And I think people will be more pleased with this new government.
And Mouin, I'm not sure if you believe he can actually heal the additional divisions that I mentioned between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, or if he'll even have that goal.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that Naftali Bennett is a radical right-wing ideologue, and the right-wing playbook, which we've seen play out around the world, is that when you first come into office, you pose as a uniter and all the rest of it. And once you run into political challenges, you very quickly resort to inflaming division and polarization and all the rest of it. And in the context of Israeli politics, I think probably the first big test is going to be tomorrow with this extreme rightist Kahanist march, which is scheduled to take place through occupied Arab East Jerusalem. And then you also have the issue of the whole secular versus ultra-Orthodox, whose budgets are now up for grabs and so on. So I think it's only a matter of time before you will see this prime minister resorting to polarization and division, and as is the case with many of his predecessors, resorting to incitement, not only against Palestinian citizens of Israel. I mean, he's previously compared Palestinians to monkeys and trees and all the rest of it, but also perhaps seeking to enter into foreign adventures in order to bolster his standing.
Okay.
Mouin,
Mitchell.
do you remember? Yes. Do you remember Ariel Sharon when he came in? What was your opinion of Prime Minister Ariel Sharon when he came in? Probably far worse than Naftali Bennett.
Maybe
and look
he'll
at how
surprise
he
us.
turned out.
And
Maybe
look at how he turned out. He united
it's
Israelis. He was more beloved than any prime minister by all Israelis. And he actually withdrew all Israeli troops from Gaza and gave it back to the Gazans so that he could make a terror piece out of it and fire rockets on Israel. Think about Ariel Sharon before you.
I mean, Mouin, we can only hope that Naftali Bennett will surprise us all. But Tom Gross, we just have a minute and a half left, and I'd like to get your final thoughts.
Well, if you look historically, it's often leaders of the right or nationalists that come in and make the ideological compromises. You have, for example, Reagan and Thatcher with Gorbachev. You have Nixon with China. You have de Gaulle with Algeria. In Israel, Menachem Begin and Egypt, and so on. So I wouldn't rule out the prospect of Bennett leading a government that could try to establish more peace treaties and possibly with the Palestinian Authority, though it's an extremely difficult thing to do. But the fact that Bennett has previously been right-wing doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a nationalist in office, as we've seen from other right-wing leaders who made compromises historically.
Okay, and quick thoughts, Tom. Mouin, as well, on Mansour Abbas, very quickly, if you think he could play a leading role in bringing that unity.
No, I mean, they've already, for example, removed supervision of the police from the committee that he will supervise. Look, I take the point about right-wing leaders that was just made. It's a valid one, but right-wing leaders tend to go against the grain, so to speak, when it's in their interest to do so. And I
Okay.
think the challenge for the Palestinians will be giving Israel and the international community sufficient reason to change their policies by what they're able to do themselves in terms of changing the reality on the ground. It's that
Okay.
simple.
Mouin, I will have to give you the last word. So unfortunately, we are out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for joining us, and our viewers, as always, for tuning in as well. We'll see you next time.